real-time ray tracing. The basic idea was essentially impossible for the longest time, but since late 2018, with the launch of NVIDIA's RTX line of GPUs and the DXR API, real-time ray tracing has gone from a pipe dream to reality. In this video brought to you by Digital Foundry and NVIDIA, I will take you on a visual adventure on the evolution of real-time ray tracing and explain what its introduction means for the gaming experience right now and for that into the future. As things stand, the state of the art is best represented by Remedy's Control. Control is a game that exemplifies some of the highest heights of traditional rasterized rendering. But on top of that, the developer has added multiple ray tracing features, with the game's visual fidelity transported to a whole new level. Going from scene to scene in this game and simply toggling the standard graphics to those enhanced with ray tracing demonstrates spectacularly why it's such a big deal and how transformative RT is to the games we play. It's incredibly impressive, but it is just one game. What about the rest of the industry? Immediately after the RTX reveal in August 2018 at Gamescom, John, Richard, and I were excited about the possibilities of real-time ray tracing just as much as we were surprised that NVIDIA had made it possible via the Turing architecture's RT core. Still, there was a big question on our minds after that presentation.
I think the key then comes down to how quickly and successfully this can be implemented.
It's almost been a year and a half since that initial reveal, and integration has been widespread, encompassing a range of developers and game engines. There's the Foundation engine and Shadow of the Tomb Raider via Nixxes, 4A Games with Metro Exodus, Remedy with Control. Then there are ray tracing integrations in cross-studio engines such as Frostbite from EA and DICE with Battlefield 5, and the new Call of Duty engine as debuted in Modern Warfare 2019, and id Tech as shown in Wolfenstein Youngblood. Bespoke RT implementations are one thing, but we're also seeing integration into middleware such as Unreal Engine 4 and Unity, where any individual developer basing their games around these engines can pick and choose from a wide array of ray-traced graphical effects provided by the middleware by default. What this basically means is that any smaller studio can enable or customize ray-traced effects already baked into the engine. What we're looking at here is momentum, more RT support even before we factor in already announced key titles like Dying Light 2, Watch Dogs Legion, and of course the colossal Cyberpunk 2077. But what I think is key to the future of ray tracing is that both Sony and Microsoft have committed to their hardware accelerated RT in their PS5 and Xbox Series X consoles, meaning that the games machines that represent the baseline for AAA development from late 2020 onwards have bespoke GPU acceleration needed to enable RT for all key games into the next generation. So at this point, hardware accelerated ray tracing seems like an inevitability, but in 2018 it was anything but that. So we were there at the Gamescom reveal and the early demos looked great, but performance was a concern. The 2080 Ti was running Battlefield 5 and Shadow of Tomb Raider at 1080p, and performance was okay enough. But if that was the high-end cards output, how would lower-end RTX cards fare? Then there was the long wait to the first game to come out of the gates, Battlefield 5. Got there first, but again, performance only reinforced the worry that hardware-accelerated ray tracing came at too high of a cost. At worst, when reflections would take up much of the screen and they were reflecting transparent objects like the leaves and explosions, or transparent god rays as you may see in this scene, at 4K it meant a minimum reduction of frame rate of around 50 or even 60% of your baseline rasterized performance. Whereas the game was playable at above 60 FPS at 4K Ultra without ray traced reflections on an RTX 2080 Ti, simply turning on ray traced reflections to low saw such a stark drop in performance. The situation has improved rapidly since then, but this all underscores the fact that developers need time to get to grips with the new toys that hardware manufacturers give to them. It's a situation that's nothing new, of course. Utilization of any given console radically improves across its generation, but more to the point, major innovations in graphics tech tend to arrive on PC first, and it's usually accompanied by upheavals in terms of performance. For example, you have the launch of programmable shader architecture. When the GeForce 3 came out as the first GPU supporting it, there were not many applications which actually supported the new programming model. Everyone was still benching games like Quake 3 Arena, and the performance cost of bump mapping and cube mapping was high as developers got to grips with it. Performance radically improved as software and drivers matured. Or you have something like Crysis. The game's very high graphical preset introduced transformative visual effects, including the first time we ever saw ambient occlusion. But that ambition had its cost in 2007. The legendary 8800 GT saw a massive 35% or more performance drop, going from high to very high in that game. New effects types and programming models require months or years until they're utilized in a more performance-friendly or optimized manner. For Battlefield 5, it took just a bit more than a month to see such progress. Now, Battlefield 5's ray tracing transformation is worth some focus here in showing not just the rapid pace of progress with hardware-accelerated RT, but also the nature of DICE's optimizations. Driver updates from NVIDIA played their part for sure, but DICE's approach here was fascinating. The game already ships with screen space reflections delivered by standard rasterization. The developer's innovative way to boost performance was to retain SSR on pixels where hardware RT would produce the exact same effect, deploying the more expensive hardware-based ray tracing only where it wouldn't. It radically reduced the overall workload and boosted performance, and had the positive side effect of incorporating transient elements into reflections, like decals that are not actually a part of the real ray traceable 3D scene. With visual wins also came performance wins. In the worst of the worst scenarios, like the scene I showed earlier at 4K on low ray tracing, it meant more than a 60% speed up in performance over the original version of the game. And as of today, with subsequent drivers and patches, that same test of low ray traced reflections at 4K in that same scene shows ray tracing reducing the frame rate by 33%, a vastly better situation than that in the launch of 2018. The situation is in fact so improved that utilizing our derived optimized settings with medium DXR, you can play Battlefield 5 at 1080p and 60 FPS on an RTX 2060. And that's even before we factor in other performance-saving measures like image reconstruction from DLSS. Ray tracing at 60 FPS on what is now a $300 GPU is a scenario we never would have envisaged back in August 2018 when the RTX cards made their debut. And I think that's another key aspect here that needs to be emphasized. In terms of NVIDIA's GigaRays metrics for RT performance, an RTX 2060 has around 50% of the ray tracing power of the top-end RTX 2080 Ti. But just like any other visually intensive and expensive setting in PC games, there's latitude here for optimizing the experience around the level of hardware you have, beyond reducing resolution. Following the example of Battlefield 5, you can utilize optimized settings in pretty much every DXR game to get the 2060 delivering 1080p 60 FPS with RT features enabled. In a game like Control, that means enabling something like the opaque reflections, which add a lot to that game's visuals. In other games like Metro Exodus, that means utilizing high settings and the high ray tracing option. You're essentially nipping and tucking those settings that contribute far less to the output image to enable those transformative effects. Standard operating procedure on PC. Is it worth it? I think so.
Take Metro Exodus again on an RTX 2060 Super.
Compare it here at high settings to 1440p, next to extreme settings at 1080p with no ray tracing, or optimized settings with ray tracing at 1080p. Performance is similar enough, and I think my point becomes clear. Ray tracing in this game has a transformative effect here, and in my opinion is more important to the game's visual makeup than other visual facets that have a similar performance cost. And there's no better example for this than the transformative effect of ray tracing in Quake 2 RTX or the upcoming Minecraft RTX. In both of these titles, traditional rasterized graphics are turned into more or less fully ray traced graphics, or more specifically, a fully path traced experience. Path tracing is a form of ray tracing that is more thoroughly realistic. Games like Control, Metro Exodus, and Battlefield 5 use a hybrid approach that balances standard rasterization with ray traced effects. Path tracing takes advantage of the generally lower, more simplistic nature of games like Quake 2 or Minecraft and uses the GPU overhead to skew much more rendering performance towards ray tracing. By increasing the randomness at which rays and sampling occurs, it makes for a more realistic image, but requires greater denoising and can be more computationally expensive. In addition to this, both the Quake 2 RTX and Minecraft RTX change the base way textures react to light by making them physically based, so that the path tracing works best, as the older textures were definitely not authored with it in mind. With these changes, the path tracing controls every single aspect of the lighting in these games, from the bounce light from the sun in Quake 2 RTX lighting up surfaces not at all touched by it, to the reflection of the environment in mirror-like surfaces like metal, all the way down to ray-traced lighting bouncing around and lighting up water vapor in the air in Minecraft RTX. In the case of Quake 2 RTX, a once very outmoded and statically lit game where shadows could not move is now a dramatically dynamic and visually stunning state-of-the-art showcase. The game is essentially reborn under ray tracing. No amount of turning up the resolution or adding in late-generation rasterization features could achieve the effects shown here. Much like Metro Exodus, we're essentially looking at the exact same assets in Quake 2 RTX in terms of polygon counts between the versions, but the way they are lit and subsequently shaded is profoundly different, and this enables that transformative effect. More than 20 years on from its release, Quake 2 has once again become a graphical spectacle, and that's all done by changing how the game achieves its lighting via path tracing. Minecraft RTX achieves a similar effect, but arguably in a more convincing manner, as the game is all about you, the player, modifying the game environment. You can mix and match and play with the world, and all of the lighting updates with your changes in real time in a way your mind expects it to. Light becomes your plaything in this game, so as much as the surface blocks themselves are. The emergent properties of light add in new creative elements. I experienced this firsthand when trying out the game at Gamescom 2019. Designers of the game made a hazard room that mixes reflective mirror blocks with other types, where you as a player have to navigate the maze with subtle clues of lighting to not be tricked by the mirrors and fall into a hole in the ground. While playing Minecraft RTX, the lighting also creates an uncanny sense that you're actually playing with these very abstract voxel blocks, almost like playing with Lego. Light reacting properly makes the game more tactile than it was before, which is funny when you consider that Minecraft is a purposefully abstract game, taking things from the real world and turning them into blocks with low-res textures that are not realistic at all. Yet path tracing on top of that foundation makes it feel real somehow, which is pretty remarkable. With path tracing having such a powerful transformative effect, it makes you wonder how much stronger it would be when applied to a modern AAA game with all of their incredibly realistic animations, character models, and extraordinarily realistic materials and environments. What would that theoretical game look like? Well, as the performance of something like Quake 2 RTX shows us, on even the mighty RTX 2080 Ti, we're probably still a while off from a fully path-traced modern game. I mean, a AAA game character has more polygons than nearly all of the Quake 2 levels put together. But in the meantime, we have a glimpse at that future with Remedy's Control, which is the most ambitious implementation of ray tracing in a modern AAA title. In Control, ray tracing is used to implement indirect diffuse lighting, which modifies the game's already existing global illumination system to give local bounce light from surfaces in the game, and subsequently the shadows from that bounce light from all of the world's objects, replacing screen space ambient occlusion. Control uses ray tracing as well for all the reflections in that game, so you can see pixel-perfect, sharp reflections on some surfaces or very rough reflections on others depending upon the material type and your viewing angle. The game also includes ray-traced reflections on transparent materials like glass, where rasterization only offers very unconvincing approximations in comparison. Ray tracing is also used to modify the way the game handles direct shadows from traditional rasterized lighting. So where normal games use shadow maps, Control adds in extra ray-traced contact shadows onto them. So those areas where shadows might not align with objects are fixed up. And those areas where the resolution of shadow maps is too low to represent small detail have that detail added in. While it's not full-on path tracing, the combined effect of all these aspects of lighting being handled or modified by ray tracing solutions has an incredibly transformative effect to some of the most simple scenes in the game to make them look incredibly realistic in comparison to the standard non-ray traced version. And much like Minecraft or Quake 2 RTX, subtle effects of light being simulated and not emulated combine and leads to incredible detail. Like how when firing a weapon, all of the ray tracing effects suddenly combine into something magical. The small pixel-perfect shadows on Jesse's hand, or the light from the muzzle flash causing bounced light to illuminate the crevice between her fingers and show them to almost glow as the light is scattered through her skin. Even zooming into her eye, you can see the gun, muzzle flash, and her arms reflected in her eye. This is all incredible detail, not at all possible without ray tracing. All these effects enabling that level of detail of course have their costs and performance, but not as much as you might think. Whereas going from no ray tracing in Battlefield 5 in 4K to low ray trace reflections reduces performance by 33%, and ultra ray trace reflections by 54%, the entirety of all of Remedy's ray tracing effects reduce performance by 44%, even though it is more ray tracing effects together than found in Battlefield 5, with each effect individually costing less than the one effect that Battlefield 5 has. That is the kind of progress that time, iteration, and engine design decisions can afford to technology. In comparison to Battlefield 5, Control was much more integrally made with ray tracing in mind, to the point where even the pre-rendered cinematic videos on the consoles have ray tracing enabled in them. And we're only looking at the first generation of hardware supporting ray tracing, and something like ray traced reflections in Control cost only about 19% more than turning on screen space reflections while being superior in every way. I see that as a great advancement, and impressive for the first generation of hardware. Enabling every single feature at once though definitely has its costs, requiring a reduction down to 1080p to maintain a mostly stable 60 FPS on an RTX 2080 Ti. This is where I come back to my point I made earlier about the quality of pixels in a game being much more important in the end than the raw amount of them. You're getting much more visual bang for the performance cost by enabling ray tracing effects than refining the resolution of already unrealistic rasterized shading. And even then, having to run a game at an internally lower resolution as a way to compensate for the heavy cost of real-time ray tracing does not need to be such a straight trade-off due to image reconstruction techniques. Take a look at games like Horizon Zero Dawn, or For Honor or The Division 2, and you see how adept developers are becoming at using reconstruction to deliver much more bang for the buck from the GPU. All of us, which brings us to DLSS, Deep Learning Super Sampling, another example of an emergent technology that has evolved and improved over time. DLSS renders the game internally at an even lower resolution than most other image reconstruction techniques, but manages to produce an image with deep learning inferencing that can have even better features than native resolution with temporal anti-aliasing. So a game rendered internally at 1440p with DLSS, bringing it up to 4K, can have even better image quality features than native 4K with TAA. Reconstruction techniques have dominated console development since the arrival of the PS4 Pro and Xbox One X, and I imagine that these next-gen versions of these technologies will open up the door to more intensive console-based RT implementations. In the PC space, DLSS is only getting better over time, to the point where Wolfenstein Youngblood's implementation can actually look better than the standard TAA presentation in many ways. Put simply, the trade-off in resolution made to enable complex effects such as ray tracing will erode even quicker than we've seen in the past. Let's not forget that the hardware features like the RT Core accelerating ray tracing is an important part in enabling it, but it is not the only one. Software advancements in image denoising and image reconstruction are just as important, and will dovetail even more with ray tracing over the next few years. So what's the takeaway here? First of all, it's pretty clear that NVIDIA took a big gamble bringing hardware-accelerated ray tracing and other architectural features to the PC market earlier than the competition. It's also taking time for the developers to adapt and to more fully exploit the new hardware. There's been a learning curve, but what surprised me is how far we've come so quickly. We've gone from low resolutions and challenging performance on the fastest GPU money can buy to, well, Control. It's as convincing a showcase as you're really going to get. But what we've also seen is the fact that ray tracing has gone from a big gamble to a sure thing. We can say that now with some degree of certainty for a few reasons. I've already mentioned that the new consoles from Sony and Microsoft will feature hardware-accelerated ray tracing. In fact, even though concrete specs are thin on the ground, both platform holders have confirmed RT support, and by extension, how important it is. And then there's the fact that NVIDIA's competitors have hardware-accelerated ray tracing on the roadmap too. While ray trace games only run on RTX cards right now, it's worth stressing that a number of them run on the DXR API built into Windows 10. It's fair to say that NVIDIA have been pioneers on the hardware side, but what secures RT's future is that DXR and its supported games are open to all vendors. With ray tracing spreading across the industry as consoles and all other hardware manufacturers utilize it in their GPUs, it's inevitable that ray tracing will eventually become as important to real-time rendering as the polygon triangle was back in the day. Now we just need to look to the future and wonder what ray tracing will still bring to the table. Visual effects such as lighting are just one possibility for ray tracing. It can be used for a vast range of other aspects which need similar information like particle physics, cloth physics. It can even work its way into how games sound and how character AI perceives the world. Also, when you look at how transformative Quake 2 and Minecraft RTX are, and consider how many classic PC titles there are that could benefit from similar enhancements, well, the possibilities are massively exciting. Personally, I want to see Doom 3 with a ray tracing remaster. Back in 2004, it was a showcase for real-time lighting, and a 2020 path traced revamp would be perfect. But that's just one potential game when so many more could benefit. I'd love to see your suggestions in the comments below. I will be eagerly waiting to see what comes next, but in the meantime, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did enjoy it, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. If you are already a subscriber, then please consider hitting that little bell in the corner to be informed as soon as Digital Foundry posts a video. If you want to talk to me about ray tracing as it is now or as it might be in the future, write a comment below and follow me and Digital Foundry on Twitter. And as always, this is Alex, bidding you farewell und auf Wiedersehen.